Native Japanese people on Reddit, what do you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing? Posting on behalf of a Japanese grandpa I know, who was born and raised in Tokyo. We're both into history, so we've talked about it a lot. He views the bombings as terrible, but doesn't fully blame or hate the US for them. Instead, he blames the emperor for not listening to military advisors like Isoroku Yamamoto, who basically warned Japan that the war they were getting into was unwinnable. He maintains that Japanese wartime rations and famine and firebombing were just as horrific and happened for years, but the West doesn't talk about those as much. He acknowledges that he's more liberal than his countrymen in this regard, possibly because he was raised by a scholarly father/mother, his words. He was also an international salesman/salaryman in the 80s, so having that world exposure opened up some of his views, he's said. He's also genuinely curious about what the American home front was like, so I've swapped stories between my own 94-year-old grandmother and him. And I try to bring him English books about the era when I visit, as Japanese publishers don't cover the topic. Native Japanese here. I don't have much to say about the political/tactical viewpoint, since I'm not an expert, just a civilian. And I think that goes for most other civilians as well. The people who lived through it, or whose parents and grandparents lived through it, only know the suffering it caused. In school we were taught dry facts about war, very little emphasis on why any decisions were made. But we did learn a lot about the effects on the common people, to the point where I was tired of spending so much time on it. We visited the bombing sites, heard survivors speak, touched the keloid scars on their arms that still burn decades later. We folded paper cranes, and were taught songs that denounced war and promoted peace, as though we were going to be able to make a difference. Today, most of us live quiet lives, and don't think about the atomic bombs, or the firebombing of Tokyo, or the land conflicts in Okinawa. But if asked, nearly every family has a war story, of would-be grandparents who died or children who starved because they were far enough from the conflict but were still affected by the wartime economy. It's just part of life. We carry the inherited memory of suffering. Edit. There have been a lot of questions about education in Japan, and /u/Flightless Kite summarized it well. I didn't know about the atrocities committed by Japan until much later either, and it is still deeply upsetting. My answer to the original question is only that Japanese civilians suffered greatly, as did those in many other places. I'm native Japanese born and raised in Japan. As some of those fellow Japanese already mentioned, in Japanese education system the majority of focus is that we are the victim of the WW2, and I did believe that for the longest time. I've been to the museum in Hiroshima, and it's simply painful to see those images of people who were bombed. I never wish that to my worst enemy, and nuclear weapons should be terminated from this world. But having said that, the US government did not have a better understanding of long-lasting effect of nuclear weapons to begin with, and Japanese have even invading those neighbor countries, and doing horrendous acts in such place China, Korea, and other southeastern countries. Massacre and recruitment of comfort women is simply not acceptable and intolerable. It's extremely infuriating that many Japanese media or politicians dismissed those acts, especially comfort women, as something like every country did that, or it was a good paying job back then. I'm looking at you, Hashimoto. It saddens me to learn many Japanese friends of mine perceive this era of Japan is just a victim, and don't know too much about other historical contexts. But at the same time, many of them don't speak or read in English or other language, so it's difficult for them to be exposed to outside view. This might be unpopular opinion, but I did appreciate that Obama paid a visit there during his presidency. After all, many people died because of the bomb, and many people, especially from Hiroshima, still struggle with certain health issues. So, long story short, I'm feeling very conflicted. Edit. Sorry I didn't expect this to blow up this much. Sorry if I didn't respond to your comments! Exclamation. Edit. Edit. Okay, first edit was 100% unintentional. Thank you for pointing it out. Native Japanese in my 20s, the bombings are in our collective mind, the representation of the atrocity of war. There's definitely a strong victim mentality, and the general public do not imagine ourselves to be the aggressors of history. We are completely oblivious to the other ***T we have committed, since the education system is structured in a way that let us sweep the past under the rug. We were graced by the US intervention that enabled us to erase any acknowledgement of our pasts, and spent the last 75 years rebuilding our national identity around being meticulous hard workers. Our society is devoted to turning everyone into company robots malleable with zero backbone. Voter turnout for people in their 20s is about 30%. We don't think about politics, and our knowledge of history is limited. So in short, bomb equals bad equals war, and that's about it. It's a really conflicting feeling. For the longest time, I felt there was no justifying the bombings. The bombings really helped to paint the country as a victim of war when being taught in Japanese history classes, and of course no one, including myself, would question it. It's only when you learn about the other side of the coin and hear about the atrocities that are hidden in Japanese education, such as yanking and comfort women, that you realize that Japan isn't in the clear. To this day, I still do not like the fact that my country still go to lengths to forget about their own wrongdoings. In the end, war itself is tragic. The bombings caused a lot of Japanese people to suffer, but we aren't the only victims of war. Although I come from a Japanese family, I see other tragedies, such as the Holocaust, in the same light. As I personally didn't suffer from war, I cannot say my way of thinking is correct. About 20 years ago, when I was living in Japan, I went to the museum in Hiroshima with my mom and a friend. While we were there, we were chatting with an elderly Japanese man. He had been living in Hiroshima during the war. He said he was elementary school aged at the time. In some of the pictures he was able to point out people he knew. I think they were doing something with wood and roads in the area. The weekend before the bombing, he had to go to the countryside to help his grandparents. He mentioned he was very lucky, as most people he knew had died that day, or very soon after. But unlucky, because of how hard life was after. One thing he said, that has stayed with me ever since, was that he thought the bomb on Hiroshima was not all bad. This was only his opinion. He said the Japanese people would never have stopped fighting otherwise. This was a big enough action for all to see they could not win. He wasn't so sure about the need for Nagasaki, other than it proved that the Americans could do it again. I'm from Japan. My views of it are very different now that I live outside of Japan compared to when I was younger and hadn't left Japan. When I was younger, I saw it as a horrible thing done to us. No excuses. No reason could justify the horrors of not only the nuclear bombs, but also the firebombings. I saw it as the evil's war, and what warlike mindsets could do to humanity. Japan was 100% the victim. When I was younger, it wasn't taught like Japan equals good, America equals bad. More of the bombs are the horrors of war, and this is why war is never a good thing. Now that I live in the US, I see it's not as simple, or black and white. I now understand why the bombs were dropped. I still believe it was a horrible thing, but I do believe it stopped the war, which is a good thing. I now feel that what Unit 731 did is more of an example of what evil humanity can accomplish vs the nuclear bombs. But again, I no longer live in Japan, and my viewpoint will not be the same as people who have lived there their whole life. My mum is from Hiroshima, with her sister and parents still living there now. She has very differing views on the bombings than her family. My mum has the view that it was a necessary evil, due to the fact that it was a quick way of ending the war to prevent further bloodshed. Additionally, the knowledge of atrocities committed by the Japanese military greatly changed her view of the bombings. Whereas the rest of her family have the view that Japan was the victim, and America was overstepping. I think this is because of the Japanese system, where very little of the atrocities are talked about. And it's mostly just about how Japan was a victim. My own personal view of the bombings are that it was required to end the war quickly. Coupled with the atrocities committed by the Japanese during the war, it was justified that the Allies dropped the bombs. I apologize for my bad grammar. This is as a result of being dyslexic.